recording, and I, in the meantime, am going to share my screen. Okay, so desktop share. So you should see, okay, cool, great. And then I just need to, so I can see, I'll zoom while I'm presenting, but y'all can't. So I'm gonna move this out of the way, it's a little less annoying. I'm guessing you guys can see this cute little cat called Wise Basket.
Yes.
The unicorn horn, great. Okay, cool. So just to start this talk on a very, very high level, you guys have probably heard of React. It is the library built by Facebook and open source with the world. And to my knowledge, maybe people would disagree with me, but it is like the most popular front-end framework on the web. And so when I say front-end, I mean basically building JavaScript, HTML, CSS. And in some ways, there are libraries that are similar to how React is, but React in many ways was, in my opinion, the first one to sort of do what it does really, really well and to become wildly popular, used like in millions and millions of applications. So, or at least by millions of developers. And React describes itself as a JavaScript library for building user interfaces, or UI, or front end, which doesn't tell us that much. And then when you scroll down, it says, hey, it's declarative, which means it clearly states what it's doing, not how it's doing. It's component-based, meaning you can break it up into small little building blocks. You can learn it once and write it anywhere. And if you've learned React, or even if you're a bit of a React pro already, you're probably very familiar with the syntax. You've seen the way you create classes or functions, the way you have a render function or just return some what's called JSX. And then React sort of hooks into the DOM and renders those things. And while that may seem familiar to some of you, it may also sound like total gobbledygook if you've never really dove into React or you're still beginning on your web development journey. And I think in some ways it is gobbledygook for a reason. The reason is that React was built for a very particular reason, to solve a really particular problem, and from a lot of really interesting sort of experimenting and trying new things. And unless you kind of walk through what that journey is, you don't really deeply understand each part of React and why it exists. And so in this talk, I'm not gonna be able to tell you everything about React, how to start coding React, the ins and outs, hooks, new features, gotchas, things to watch out, how to optimize it. But I hope that you walk away with the sense of, okay, when I look at React, it doesn't look like gobbledygook, or if I'm familiar with it, it actually has a deeper meaning because I understand how we went from pure JavaScript to a React-style framework. And specifically, I want to kind of demystify and walk through a few things. So I'm going to go ahead and move my browser to the side. I'm going to start just with this entire talk is going to take place just in an index.html file. And one thing I want you to know is that I'm keeping this talk as simple as possible in terms of files and libraries. So if you look, there's this repository called Oops, You Invented React. And this is a GitHub repository on publicly on my GitHub, which I'm going to actually link to right now because I realized I forgot to share this. So let me go to Zoom. I'm going to just briefly go to the chat. Let's see. Actually, let's see. I'm going to stop sharing. Sorry, this is a little snafu. I should have done this before. The repo is here for those of you who want to check it out and hack along. If not, I suspect it'll be totally fine if you just totally focus on the talk. So, okay, so let me go back to sharing. Cool. So what I want to emphasize before I begin is that I'm not going to use any magic because I kind of want to show you how React is built up. And so if you look, I've got an index.html file, a file that most of us are pretty familiar with. And you can see I've got a git ignore. This is just literally a little boilerplate to make sure I don't accidentally commit things to GitHub that I don't want there. But other than that, I've got this index.html, and I have the solution. Everything I'm going to code up is in this file. This is just for me in case I freak out, I need to copy and paste stuff, I'll do that. But other than that, we're going to work just out of this one file and build things up from scratch. So to jump in, I kind of want to give you an overview of what you're going to learn about and kind of experience and walk through in this talk. And remind me if I don't do this, but I'm going to kind of, if I can, try and speak in second person. So kind of describe this as if you yourself were doing it. So this is the HTML we'll be using to do our talk, but it's also the talk outline. So I kind of want to start out on a high level and talk about the way that in 2010, and we're going to rewind all the way back to 2010, before React was invented in 2011, people built web dev by a mixture of HTML and JavaScript. And here's the HTML for that. And then they wrote some JavaScript in a different file usually, or just in a different, like below it. They would then go up and update this thing. And then there are other ways, and then from there, I want you to kind of imagine you're kind of exploring. You're saying, wow, like this is kind of weird. I have HTML in one spot and JavaScript in another spot. Is there a way to kind of combine them together? So you go on this exploration where you're like, can I, sort of taking just a HTML div, use JavaScript to inject HTML into this root, and maybe start generating HTML from JavaScript. And it's going to be messy. It's going to be complicated, but it's going to be kind of a step forward into your exploration. And from there, you're going to develop a library to kind of make this kind of jumping from JavaScript HTML into, so from JavaScript, like creating HTML and dumping it into the web page. You're going to create a library that you're going to call Rehacked, because it's kind of a hack to get a library. You're kind of rehacking together the web page. It doesn't sound at all anything like the library we're talking about. And then from there, we're going to kind of talk about how you sort of explore from that library into building some reusable functions. And then, horror of horrors, joy of joys, you're going to realize, oh my gosh, in this exploration, I actually invented React. And I can switch to React by changing, literally, removing the H from Rehacked into React, and I have a working React app. And then from there, we're going to talk about some kind of wish list improvements to React called JSX that kind of makes React easier to read. And from there, we'll have talked through some nitty-gritty stuff. We'll build an app that's kind of not very important and very, very simple. But when you walk away, you'll have a sense of, wow, this is what it means to go from understanding HTML and JS to understanding React and why it's useful and how it's actually built. Before I jump in, for those of you who are a little bit more experienced with React, you should know React does some really fancy things. It does some really fancy optimized things, and I'm actually leaving that entirely out of it. I'm mostly focusing on the parts of React that you really need to get started to think about how it's being used from a developer perspective. So just know that I'll be leaving some stuff out. So with that said, we're going to jump in. And so I want all of you guys to just take a deep breath. And for those of you who are over 10 years old, imagine what you were doing in 2010, roughly around there. What life felt like, what was going on for you. And know that maybe you were web developing. I definitely was not. I was a sophomore in high school. I didn't know what coding was, but people were building websites on the web. And they were building it in a particular way. And so to show off that way, I'm going to go ahead and just basically open this index.html file in Chrome. There's a shortcut here in my text editor. You can also just double-click index.html to open it. And I kind of want you to focus on, you'll see that basically for each of the sections of my talk, I've got a section in this HTML file, right? And also you can see it appearing here in the document. And so what I want to start with is HTML and JSS root. And so this is what coding was like. So again, it's a simplification. There were lots of things going on, but in the simplified world, in 2010, back wherever you were, people were building the web, and they were building it like this. Let's say the task at hand was, I need to build a website, and I'm going to assume the website, whatever's contained inside of this kind of like dotted area. It basically displayed the year, current year, and basically displayed however many seconds past the minute. So you'll notice if I'm going to hit refresh on this browser. I know if it's 2 seconds past the minute. And refresh again, 4 seconds. Wait a bit, refresh again. It's 6 seconds. So basically, this is dynamically updating. So you've got static HTML. So I'm going to basically just zoom in and focus on this. So people would write this HTML. They give it an ID, some style. You can see the border is styled here. You can see we're using an H1 tag that's colored coral, nice little color, to create the year text. We're using a span to put the word, in this case, 2010. But what you'll notice is that when I refresh the page, the web page refreshes. So there's something dynamic about this. And the fact that there's a 2010 here in my HTML, and there's a 2020 in the code. So this sort of breaks the illusion that we're in 2010. I know, we're just imagining. If I zoom down here, this is kind of what web dev looked like back in the day. So if you look here, you've got your HTML up here, which you went through. And now to make this page dynamic, for example, when I load it, it changes what second we're on. You'll see that we have some JavaScript. And for the point of this talk, I'm going to assume that you understand JavaScript or understand some language. You can probably just sort of guess at the syntax of JavaScript. And all I'm doing is I'm getting the current time, which if you just declare a new date, it just grabs the current time. Then I'm going to my document, which is literally this entire document here, the HTML document, and I'm selecting within my HTML and JSS root the year class H1 tab. So you can see that right here. I'm selecting that, basically reaching in, kind of like a surgeon would reach into like someone's body for like a particular organ, right? I'm reaching down and I'm selecting it, and then I'm storing that in the variable year, and then I'm going to year and I'm saying, okay, I want to change what your inner HTML is to be the current time get the full year from the current time, and then convert that to a string. And that's why when it says 2020 here. So I could go here and I could say plus hi, save that. I'm going to refresh the page, and you can see, right, I've now added the word hi, and I've sort of injected it into this sort of year reading thing down here. And I realized I misspoke. I said I was selecting the H1, and I'm actually selecting just this year thing, year section down here. So if you're following along right now and you're kind of like, this is confusing, like there's a lot of code, you're using a lot of words, it's true. And if you're feeling confused, it's because there's actually something that's not really that great about this. When you look at the page, you can immediately see what this app does, right? It says the year, and it says the current seconds. And when you look at the HTML, you kind of can see what's going on, right? You can see it's a little bit cluttered, to be honest, but you can sort of see, okay, there's a header 1, there's going to be a span, there's going to be another header, there's going to be another div. And so you can kind of map one-to-one what's on the page to the HTML. But when you get down to this JavaScript, sure, you might know JavaScript, but there's a lot of really weird things going on, right? For example, to get an element, I have to write all this long series of CSS selectors that honestly don't really correspond to what I'm seeing on the page. I'm sort of explicitly, or I say imperatively, I'm telling the computer to have to set the inner HTML, which just feels weird. And all this is sort of updating the web page, which I like, but at the same time, it's very disjointed. I've got my structure up here, and I've got something that's kind of updating the structure, but it's like very separated and hard to read. And so the truth was in 2010, people thought this was awesome. They were like, we have web pages, they're updating, they're dynamic, we're setting things. They use a library called jQuery, which many of you may have used, which basically does exactly what this library right here, what this document.query selector is doing. They kind of make it easier to grab things, to kind of sort of reach into the web page and change stuff. And they were like, web is awesome, we got JavaScript. But I want you to imagine that in 2010, you start web dev and you're like, this doesn't cut for me. This is pretty confusing. Like, I think there's gotta be a better way. And so you look up, and you're looking at this HTML and you're saying, I want a really dynamic web page. And so what if I just scrapped the idea of HTML at all? And I said to myself, look, I kind of get what's happening here. I'm specifying HTML. The browser's then reading that, and then they're displaying it into a web page. But what if, since I can already reach into the HTML, what if I just started with an empty div? That's kind of the root of this thing that I want to create. And instead of putting HTML, I could just basically dump everything in from JavaScript. And this is kind of a cool idea because now you're not really dealing with HTML anymore in terms of an HTML section. You could just do everything purely in JavaScript. And it's 2010, the web is really new. You're really excited about this idea. You're like, this is cool. I'm gonna innovate the web. I'm gonna move everything to JavaScript. And so as we jump into this, I'm gonna sort of move to the next section where I'm gonna kind of see if I can reproduce all of this right here down here in this just.js root. So I want to just basically start with this kind of blue section that's kind of collapsed right now and do it with just JavaScript. And spoiler alert, it's going to totally suck. But before I do that, and since we're still in this exploration, I kind of want to do a quick intro that will be familiar to some of you and maybe less familiar to others, which is that when I'm coding, especially when I'm trying something new, even back in 2010, I don't just rely on my code and the web page. I actually use something called developer tools. And in this case, I'm in Chrome because I want Google to have all my information and track me and basically be big brother and control every part of me. So I make sure I use Chrome for everything. I can basically right-click on the web page and click Inspect. And what this is going to do is it's going to show me a kind of an intermediary step that sits between the code that I'm writing in this document and the output that I'm seeing on the web page. And so one thing you need to know is that while this HTML I'm writing is written in plain text, the browser basically, this is a simplification, but the browser basically interprets this HTML text and it builds what we call the DOM, which is a fancy way of saying the data object model. And all that really means is it takes your HTML and it puts it into a format where it exists in the browser, in the web page. And so you can see here, for every element that exists on the page, for example, year, I'm going to hover it, I can get some information about that. It's an H1 tag. It's got a color of FF, well, basically a color of orange, the font size, and the margin. And I can also see when I hover this element, I can see where it exists here in my developer tools. And I don't know, is this a little bit small to read, April?
Yeah, it's a little small, but I think the idea is still there. I mean, if you guys
Okay.
can let us know if you need to see it more clearly.
Sure. Sure. And yo, April, quick question. How often do you use like your developer tools?
All the time, all day.
Okay. Yeah. So this is like, so this might be new for some of us, but as you start Kobe coding, this is going to be sort of your lifeline and what you use all the time. So you can actually see, look at this HTML I've written in text has been converted to something that's dynamic and being displayed, or I guess not dynamic, but now it's being living inside the browser. And so you can see each part as I go down, seconds past the minute. You can see here's this div container, and inside the div container, I've got a span that's got the 18 seconds, and I've got this sort of seconds label, and it's italicized. And so what's really nice about this here is that I can sort of interact with things nice. I can actually go in and play around with stuff. I can like change the numbers that exist in here. I could go like that. It updates it there. And I could even delete an element. So this basically just gives me a more dynamic way of playing with things. And I can also go in and refresh the page and copy authorization to the board. Oops. It looks like just let's see. Sorry, technical difficulties here. Copy authorization to clipboard. Let me see if I can. There we go. Okay, great. So we're back in. Refresh the page. It's back to how it was. Cool. So let's jump into our first task. So on a high level, we have one goal, right? It's to basically reproduce this using just JavaScript. So what I'm going to do is, for those of you who are more familiar with JavaScript, know that when you create a script tag, you can write JavaScript inside of it, even if it's an HTML file, and that JavaScript is shared with everyone, so all these variables are floating around. But I'm just going to sort of create a tag to focus in on this one section. So to do this, I'm going to need to create some elements. So I'm going to go to console to kind of demo this. I know what to do when I have HTML elements existing, and I can basically go into the JavaScript, select them, and then set properties of them to update them. But what do I have to do if I want to create an HTML property? So many of you probably don't know this. In fact, I didn't even know this, and I was a professional web developer. And the reason why was because we don't actually use these methods anymore. But by using them, you're going to get kind of insight. So what I can actually do is go to the document, and so this is my console. You can see the document is literally the entire web page. When I hover it, it hovers everything. It's got the body inside of it. It's got inside of it this section. And so I can start with this document. I'm going to go ahead and say document, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to say create element. So this is not going to add an element automatically, but it's going to create a new DOM or document element, basically like what HTML gets converted to. I can specify exactly what I want. So in this case, I want to create an H1 because I want to basically reproduce the year here, which is an H1 tag. So when I do that, you'll see I've created a basic H1 tag printed out. So again, you can actually open up your browser right now and play along with me. That's if you kind of already know this. If not, I'll sort of do things. I'm going to call this my year title equals document.create element H1. So now I've stored it in a year title thing. Then what I want to do is, right now you can see this H1 is empty. So I'm going to go year title. I'm going to say inner. You can say inner text or HTML. In this case, I'm going to say HTML. It just basically, they basically do the same thing. I think I'm going to set it to be the oops, inner HTML is not a function. Okay, so let's see what's going on here. So I've created this DOM, and I'm going to say, oh, I see what's going on. So basically, what I need to do now is to basically year title dot inner HTML equals year. So now what I'm doing is I'm setting the inner HTML. And you can see it's been well, you can't actually see from this, but it's been set. If I print out year title again, you can see it's an H1 tag with this content. And now if I want to do something like, for example, I want to set the style on it, I can go in and say, okay, year title. I want to set one of its HTML attributes. So if I look up here, I can see that it's got a style attribute that has a color set to coral. I can go set attribute, and I can say, okay, I want to set the attribute style, and I want the attribute to be set to color is coral. So I can do that, and then if I go ahead and say console log my year title again, you can see it's H1 with style, coral, and year. And now that I've done that, I can go ahead and say, okay, I want to go ahead and say document dot query selector, and I'm going to go in and select this sort of empty div right here called JS root. and like this. And once I've selected that, oh, sorry, whoops, that's the wrong syntax. So for those of you, I'm not going to get into this too much right now, but basically for those of you who are familiar with CSS, this is the way you specify an ID. So I've now selected the root element that we know is empty. All it's got is a let's append children, the DOM children here, right here. Selected this. And now if this feels boring and tedious, there's a reason why I'm doing this, and you're going to see in a second. It's because it is boring and tedious. And finally, I created my element. I've selected this root element I want to do, and I'm going to go ahead and say document.query selector. I'm going to go ahead and say append, which is a fancy way of saying tack onto the inside of it, like sort of stick inside at the end of whatever's there, if there's anything there. I'm going to go append year title, hit enter, and boom. I'm feeling exhausted just talking about this. I hope you're feeling a little bit exhausted and overwhelmed, because that was a ton of work, and look what we got. It's very little output. I had to write a ton of text to do that. But I'm generating HTML in JavaScript, which, while is really annoying, for me, or for you as you're imagining in 2010, this is a cool exploration. So I've already kind of written up this code. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy it in like so to our index.html file. And I'm gonna go down here to our script that we just opened and copy it in. And you can see basically in non-console form, everything we just did. We got the root at the top here. Then we went in here, we created the year title. We said its attributes, we said its inner HTML, and we appended it. And so if I were to go ahead and just clear this console and refresh the page, you'll see that I've updated it, and basically the same thing is being done now in JavaScript. Although I can see that I made a typo here. It's actually supposed to be the year. So I'm going to save that, refresh it. We've done it. So when you look at this, and this seems pretty unintuitive to you, and like, yes, now I haven't written any HTML, and I've done it all in JavaScript, but you're like, actually, this is just as confusing as this. You're right. This is not really an improvement, and it's actually way worse, because what you're about to see is I actually haven't built this whole element yet, and I need to go ahead and build it. So I'm not going to live code this, because this would be an incredible waste of all of your time, and I really value all this time, and I'm really grateful you're all here with me. So I'm just going to copy and paste in all of the JavaScript that it would take to reproduce this down here. So I'm going to refresh the page. And yes, there's that typo where it says the time, and I'm going to switch that to year and refresh it again. But you can see up here, we created something purely by HTML and just injecting things in JavaScript. And down here, we've got this just.js root, which you can look at right here. Our just.js root, it's totally empty. So no fun and games. And we have written, oh my gosh, how many lines of JavaScript? From line 63 all the way down to almost, past line 113. So we're talking like crazy amounts of JavaScript just to get this. So it's 2010, you're exploring, you're trying to be innovative. You've been able to generate a web page using just JavaScript, but honestly, you kind of realize nobody in the world is going to adopt the strategy because it's a total pain in the butt. And as you look at your page, you sort of expand it out, and you're kind of excited that you did this, but also a little bit discouraged because it's really annoying and you haven't really innovated. But as you're playing around, you play around with your little zoom in or outer on your keyboard, and you start to zoom out and out. And you start to push it back and back and back. And you start to push it back so far and so tiny that you really can't read the words anymore. And you can't even quite tell what the code is doing, even though you know what it is in your head. And you look, and it almost starts to form a pattern. You look and you can see, okay, there's a chunk of about 3 lines. And those lines are doing 3 things. They're creating an element of some type, maybe H1. Then the next line, so I'll zoom in a little bit. Then they're basically setting any attributes that HTML element needs. And finally, they're setting the inner text, or the children, what goes inside of that HTML element. And so as you zoom back out, you see that pattern popping up again and again and again. You see it when you create your first H1. You see it when you create your first span. You see it when you create your second H1. You see variations, but when you create spans within divs. And not only is that being repeated, but over and over again, you're basically having to append these created elements into the root. So basically selecting the root or selecting a wrapper div and basically shoving all this HTML you created in JavaScript into it in order to get it to appear on screen. And so while you haven't revolutionized JavaScript, you're noticing a pattern, which is that if you want to work in JavaScript and create HTML, you kind of need 3 things and 1 final thing. So the 3 things are this tag type. the attributes, and sort of the children, or what goes inside of it. And then, of course, the last little step is you need to append it to the actual web page. And so a little bit discouraged, but kind of intrigued. You say, well, I'm a growing developer, and one thing I know that is good you should never do in coding is repeat yourself over and over and over again. And this is basically what I'm doing. So what if I did this? What if I took this repeating pattern and put it in a function inside of a function that I could reuse over and over again? It's a little bit more general. And so maybe I'll pass in the things they need. I'll pass in the tag type, I'll pass in the style, and I'll pass in the inner text. And that way, I don't have to repeat so much code. And so you're not doing anything brilliant here. You're just doing normal, standard, run-of-the-mill, sort of building abstractions, building functions, kind of being more modular as a programmer. But you decide to try it out. And so what you end up creating is two JavaScript objects that are useful to you. And I'm going to go ahead and see, in the name of time, well, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and introduce these to you in a second. First, I'm just going to sort of walk you through the intuition behind creating this function. So again, small steps. These are all leading us like sort of incredibly towards React. So I'm going to go in here and say, okay, let's make this a function. So if this were a function, I'm going to go const. I'm just going to call it create element, because that's sort of what they call it in HTML, and I'm just going to do it in JavaScript. And I know that I need three things. So I need the tag name to be passed in. I'm going to use some modern JavaScript here. This is just a way of declaring a function. So I'm going to pass in tag name of the element I want to create. I'm going to pass in any attributes, as I said. And what I'm actually going to do here is a slight renaming. I'm going to call these props or properties. And the reason why it's a slight difference. Basically, it's called an attribute when you write it on the HTML tag, but once it gets converted into the actual DOM, we call it a property, because it's now a property of a real living, breathing thing. So, for example, when we look at this here, we're setting this attribute, but when it gets actually converted into this real thing, we call it a property. So I'm going to pause a second if there's any questions or something, but I'm just trying to wrap this last thought. So you kind of don't want to repeat yourself. So you jump in, you say, I got a tag name, I got some props, and last thing I'm going to say is basically like, I'm going to call it children. This is basically anything that goes inside of the tag. So in this case of the year, it's an H1 tag, and inside of it, the children, or whatever goes inside, is just the words the year. So I have this create element function. Just to sort of make it simple, I'm going to copy and paste this in here and just kind of convert it to a little bit more of a general form. I'm going to go ahead and just say this is going to be an element here. I'm going to document.create element. I'm going to name it tag name. So basically, I can now create any tag I want. I'm going to go ahead and set an attribute. In this case, I'm just going to set one. I'm going to go ahead and set the attributes. And what I would need to do, I'm going to skip writing this code out in detail, but basically what I need to do is go ahead and say something along the lines of, for each property, right, for each, I'm going to basically want to do this code, go into it, and set the appropriate attribute. So I'm going to kind of hand wave that code. And then finally, at the last thing, I'm going to kind of want to go in and this here, element, set the attributes. I'm going to want to set any of the inner HTML. And I'm going to go ahead and want to return that element. It's annoying. And basically what I've done is, I can now, instead of having to write all that code, I could just basically go in here and say create element h1, pass in any properties that I want rendered, and then go ahead and pass in any of like the children that I want below. So in this case, it would just be something like the year. And so to kind of put this into action, I'm not going to waste your time going through and coding all of it. I'm just going to go ahead and jump in and just copy and paste the code that I've already written so you can see it. So here, I'm just going to copy and paste over this so it's fresh. So here's the annoying JavaScript before we did everything in JavaScript. And now it's still being done in JavaScript, but I kind of created these functions, and I'm kind of encapsulating an object, calling it React as a create element function, and then a render function to render to the DOM. So now when we look at creating a title, it's a lot more intuitive. So basically, to create a title, I go ahead and call my React module, and I say create element, which is this function right here. I pass in an h1. I want to style it as Coral. That's one of my properties. And I give it the time. And if I run this code, you're going to see right here in this sort of new React helper function, this module we created to make web dev easier, we should basically be able to create this h1 here. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page. What you'll see is down in here, I've created this, I created a header here using this new method. And so I want to take a slight pause here. I'm also curious why, oops, I made a little typo. This is why it's not running. Wait, refresh it. So here's our pure JavaScript solution, and here's our sort of in the works functional approach to using functions. And April, I don't know if now is a good time. What I want to do jump into next is just quickly kind of rehash what is in this function. But if there's anything you want to say or I should pause, let me know. If not, I'll just jump on forward.
I told you my dog was going to come in and cause chaos, so I had to mute myself for a minute.
Nice.
No, I mean I'm following along fine, and I haven't seen any questions in the chat. So unless somebody wants to jump in with a question right now, we can probably just move forward.
Great, awesome, cool. So if you haven't guessed, one side note, I realized you're kind of wondering why am I putting this one single function inside? There's no other functions to sort of encapsulate inside of an object. Why am I putting this one render method inside of an object? The reason is why is because we're kind of setting things up to magically turn into React. But don't tell anyone because this is 2010, React isn't developed yet. But just between us, that's what's going on. So basically, I kind of talked through this a second ago, but here's the function that I've done to kind of not repeat the code. You can see I first go into the document, I create a new element of whatever the tag name I pass in, for example, h1. Then I go ahead and this is just some fancy way when I have an object of this form, I can go ahead and just get an array of all the keys. So object.keys just gets all the keys, which in this case is just a simple array of one key, which would be style. And then for each of those keys, I go ahead and I take that property name, in this case style, and I take that element, I set the attribute style to be basically whatever is stored in props for that prop name. So in this case, it would say, what's at the key style? Oh, it's color coral. And I set the attribute to be style equals color coral on this DOM node that I'm creating, or this DOM element that I'm creating. And then for this, and then basically for any children that you wanted to render, I go through each child, and if it's a string, I just go ahead and set, and I just add it to the inner HTML, plus equals child. Otherwise, if it's not a string, I'm just going to assume that it is a DOM node, and I'm going to append it. And so it may be to kind of illustrate why this is useful, let's go ahead and build another part of the page. So we're down here, right, building the page. Let's say that what I want to build is just sort of this lower section right here. And to refresh our brains, let's take a look at what this lower section is. It's got an h1 tag, which we know how to do. And it's got something kind of interesting, right? We've been sort of generating HTML from JavaScript, but when we look a little bit closer, we see that this is a challenge we haven't encountered, which is that we actually need to nest things or basically create this element with some children inside of it. And so this is a little bit of a challenge. Let's see if we can walk through it with our new rehacked module and see if it makes it a little bit easier or if it's just even doable. So I'm going to go ahead and see what we can do here. So I'm going to, we already know how to do an H1, so I'm actually just going to focus just on creating this little tidbit of code you see right here. So the first thing I want to do is create this seconds container div. So I'm just going to go in here and kind of edit this. I'm going to just call this seconds container. I'm going to create an element. I want it to be a div. And I want, let's see, is there any styling set to this div? Nope, it's just got that. So I just want to set the class on it. So I'm going to go ahead and just say, I want to set a class of seconds container. And then finally, are there any children of it? Yes, there are 2 children. But what I'm going to do for now is I'm just going to leave, I'm just going to, well, let's see, I'll just leave the children blank. Let's see if our code breaks because I actually haven't tested on this. But let's refresh it. And yeah, I broke the code. I'm just going to go ahead and just, I'm going to leave it blank. I'm just going to.
Say an empty array should work for you, right?
Oh, yes. Thank you, April. That's actually a really smart way of doing it because basically what that's indicating is that this is going to be an array of things. Let's see if, well, I think it'll work. You know, actually, let's test it. I think that's really close. That's actually a really brilliant intuition because of the spread operator.
Yeah.
I think what I'm realizing is that it's actually, well, Oh, I think I know what's happening. It's basically taking this to be one of the children. And so it's taking this child and it's basically trying to append it to the DOM, I think is going to be the error. Seconds container has already been declared. Actually, no. Wait, no, actually, April, I think it's a seconds container has already been declared. Oh, okay. So, yeah. So what's going wrong in my code is basically, typically in modern JavaScript, we write modules where like variables aren't shared between files, but I forget that we're in one giant file. So I'm accidentally reusing this. So I'm just gonna delete this now for simplicity's sake, and refresh this. Okay, and then we're gonna render seconds container here. Okay. Thanks for being with me. This is live coding. We're seeing some problems and issues, and you can see live collaboration. April sort of helping me think through it as we go, using some error messages in our process. Cool.
Always read your error message.
Yes, thank you, April, because I was actually debugging the wrong bug, as you probably saw there. It was not to do with what I thought. There was an earlier bug. So great great reminder. So let's go ahead, and we are using this just rehacked route. So I'm going to click here and see if we've created what we want to. And I go in here and I say, oh, well, look at this. So here's our just rehacked route. And inside, we've created a div with club class seconds container. It's exactly what we wanted. So now comes the challenge. What we really want, though, is this thing up here. We want some nested elements. So we want two spans inside. And so there's a solution to this. It's not going to be beautiful, but it'll work. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to duplicate. Seems like my ID is going a little crazy. I'm going to duplicate this code. I'm going to call it. I'm going to go ahead and just go like, oops. I'm going to go ahead and call this a seconds number, which is one of the elements you want to create. Seconds number, and then I'm going to make it a span type. Class seconds number. And then we know that we want to put a number inside of it. So this case, I'm just going to put a placeholder. I'm just going to put 42 because we all love 42. And then if I refresh the page, nothing's actually changed because that element is still just sort of floating out in ether. So you can see that this div has seconds class is still empty. And I need to dump it. Somehow I need to dump the span inside seconds class. That's exactly what this last parameter for is. It's for basically adding children. So I'm going to go ahead and say seconds number and pass that in as a child that I want to live inside of this div. I'm going to save that, refresh it. And what you can see is, ta-da, we've done exactly what we set out to do. There's one span inside of it. You can imagine you get the second span, literally the same thing. In this case, I am going to pass in just an empty array because I don't actually have any props that I need for this one. And I'm just going to say space seconds, go ahead, render it. Something broke. Let's see what broke. Syntax error. Identified seconds number has already been declared. Whoops. Let's go ahead and fix that. We'll just call this seconds label. And I'm going to take that and pass it in as a child, which I also forgot to do. And now let's see if we get any error messages. No error messages. And we've actually created exactly what it was that we had up here, so helpfully, which was a parent div, and we've injected some children into it, as you can see. And then if I jump up here, same situation, parent div with the children inside of it. And so after our sort of crushing defeat of like doing this sort of massive wall of text to do everything in JavaScript and repeating ourselves like crazy and feeling not great about that, we've actually started to recreate this in a little bit more of a simpler way. It's still not beautiful. You can see here, it's kind of clear. I've got a seconds number, I'm declaring it. I've got a seconds label, I've got a seconds container, and I'm putting the seconds number, the seconds label inside of my, as children inside of this container. We can see clearly that there's spans, that this is a div. We can see any properties we're setting, such as the class that we're passing in. We can pass in more properties as we want. And then ultimately, we're using rehacked DOM, just a nice little convenience thing to pass in this top level component, a seconds container, and then to render it to rehacked root, right? This existing HTML element where it can just kind of be dropped in. Right, so I can show you guys, right here. So rehacked root is where it's being sort of dumped in, hopefully. So at this point, it's 2010, and people are sort of doing this sort of crazy mayhem, like surgeon gone wrong, like jumping into the DOM and changing things. And what you've just done is you basically started with an empty HTML file and generated all of your HTML from scratch using JavaScript in a somewhat beautiful way, right? It kind of starting to do what React told us, again, this is a fast forward, so don't tell anyone that we're jumping to the future, but we are. It's sort of starting to do what React promised, which is it's declarative, right? It's basically saying, this is what I'm doing, rather than sort of these complicated code, just saying we're creating an element, it's going to be a seconds number, we're creating an element, it's going to be a seconds label. It's component based in some ways, right? We kind of got like these individual little pieces that we're sort of putting together into building blocks, right? We got, again, the way we attach them is a little bit janky. We have to kind of pass them into a function, but still, they're individual pieces we can move around, right? I could reuse this if I want. I could basically say, hey, we could use another seconds label up in here and go like this, add it in, and boom, refresh my page, and nothing happens, which is always what you want to happen in a demo. So let's actually see. Oh, I see what's going on. It's sorry, I was getting excited. I getting ahead of myself. Basically, this is a little bit of a diversion, but the DOM is basically recognizing that I've created one new DOM element, and so when it appends it, it's just appending the exact same thing. It's sort of like in the same way there's only one April, and I could be like, yo, I'm gonna have a meeting with 3 people. It's gonna be me, April, and April. Even though I invited 2 Aprils, there's only one April in the world, so that's why this didn't work. But you could basically imagine, to kind of get back to the main point, you can imagine that I could create many different kinds of components and use them all over the app to do different things. So we're sort of getting close to this promise of React, which is going to be invented next year in 2011, but hasn't been invented yet. And then this idea of learning once, write anywhere. So it's really not, we're just using it. This is literally vanilla JS. You can open a text editor right now and create this file and open it in any browser and it'll work. We're not using, this is not Angular. We don't have our own transpiler. There's no fancy like Babel or like whatever Webpack. This is just pure JavaScript. So we're getting somewhere. So now you're actually starting to get a little excited. You're like, I'm really onto something. I've got this great thing. And you go ahead and you say, well, this is good. But as we tried, one problem we saw, which was we tried to basically reuse, for example, the seconds label. It didn't really work because, we created one DOM node. I can invite, no matter how many times I add to the DOM, it's still gonna be that one DOM node. It's only be one of them. I can only invite April to a meeting once, only one April. It would be cool if there was a more general way to basically reuse things, because while we haven't, we've created this rehack that doesn't reuse code for generating elements, like any web page, it's set up of repeated elements, right? You can see here, for example, in this web page, right? They've clearly created one type here, which is this sort of like light gray, kind of thin, hip font, H3, and they're reusing it over and over and over again. They would use it here. They would use it here. And we don't really have that functionality super supported in our situation right here. Like if I wanted another seconds label, what I would literally have to do is go here, second label 2, go like that, and then I'm going to go ahead and append it here, go ahead and refresh, and now I've got a second thing. It would be better if there was an easy way to just sort of quickly reuse code without having to copy and paste things like this. So that's your next sort of insight and idea. And to get to this insight, you sort of do something that's a really, really hot topic, an increasingly hot topic in programming, and that many people in our community at Inland Empire Software Developers are very passionate about. In fact, they're almost like, it's almost religious, which is functional programming, which is programming with a very particular way of using functions. And we could give 20 or 12 talks on this topic, so I'm not going to really get into it. But this is sort of the inspiration for your next step. You say, okay, so this is great. I do this, and it spits out an element. I kind of want to abstract this to a function that I can reuse over and over and over again. So what you do is this. You say, okay, let's do this, for example, for our seconds number. Let's make this a reusable function. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy. I'm going to cut this, and I'm going to go ahead and create a function that I want to reuse. I'm going to give it all capitals because it's going to sort of signify that this is an element in my DOM that I'm going to kind of reuse over and over again. So I'm going to make this function. you're going to specify just the very bare minimum of what you need to create the second numbers. I don't want to have to keep repeating myself. So for example, you can see that here, right, I'm kind of creating 2 spans. I want to do as little repeated code as possible. So what I'm going to say is, basically, what I want you to pass in is just a few things. So I want you to pass in basically a object that has basically the properties you want set. So we're familiar with this. And I'm going to pass in these props or properties here. And then I want you to pass in the children that you want displayed inside. So I'm going to go like this. And so basically 2 parameters. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and return this create element function that we're very familiar with now. And it's going to take in the props like that. And it's going to take in children in a more generalized way. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this and just kind of make this generalized function. So it takes in props, it takes in children, and it returns this rehacked create element span with props and children. And I'm just going to call this, sorry, a little kind of confusion here. I'm going to call this just basically like a reusable span. And what I'm going to next do is I can now use this span. So I could go ahead and say this is a function, reusable span. I'm going to pass in the props that I need, pass in the props I need, which is the class, and the thing inside of it. And so what you're looking at here is I've created a function to abstract away this React.create component. And I've just been talking at you a lot. Let's take a deep breath. And you're like, okay, David, where are we going? Why are you showing this? Why are you trying to wrap it into function? What does this have to do with functional programming? Why does this even matter? When are we going to get to React? You just keep saying rehacked over and over again. But I want you to look at something. This is actually a big improvement, because what we've done is we've created a simple way to create elements that it's kind of verbose and kind of hard to read, but we've hidden that inside this reusable span function. And now I can run around my code base and just say reusable span, the function, and pass it just what I want to pass to it, which is the props and the children, and it's going to spit back out the DOM element that I need to use. And just to prove that to you, I'm going to go here and say const seconds, what do we call this? For the seconds number, just as before, equals this reusable span here. And you can see that we're passing seconds number in. When I go to refresh the page, we get the exact same thing, right? So we've just kind of wrapped it in a function. It still works. But here's where the power comes in. And again, this is a simple example, so it's going to seem like not that big of a jump. But imagine this on a massive code base. So I'm like, wow, I'm actually going to use a ton of reusable spans in my code base. So for example, this seconds label is technically a span, right? The span got no properties, and it has children of seconds. So let me go ahead and make this a little bit more readable. So I'm going to go in here and say reusable span. I don't need to pass span because I've sort of already encapsulated that in the function. I can pass an empty object because I have no props I want to set on it. And I can go ahead and say, yeah, I need to have seconds. I can go ahead and refresh the page. And we've got sort of the exact 2 spans that were nested just the way we wanted. And you're like, okay, David, that's great. I get what you're going to do. It's you sort of invented this nice little parlor trick. You could go in here, right, and basically abstract this to a function. So I'm going to do that really fast. I'm going to call it const. Let's see. I'm just going to call it a div container because that's what it is. Div container equals basically. Oops, sorry. Nice thing about live coding is it's live. The bad thing about live coding is that it's live. So you have to watch me type. Okay, so we created a div container. And so I'm going to replace this right here with a much nicer div container, passing in props to that div container, and some children. So one thing I'm realizing now is that this children situation right here, actually, this is a spread operator. I'm not going to get into what this is. Basically, it just says get all the parameters that are after props. So I'm going to do this, and I'm going to go ahead and create element. And I'm going to go ahead and just spread the children in here. And so now you'll see, well, our code is getting a little bit shorter, right? We're able to reuse the span for both the seconds number and for the seconds label. and we sort of made it cleaner to create this div container, which we can then use in other spots. And then we're passing in these children. So let me refresh. Let's see if there's not any bugs. There probably should be some bugs. Amazing. It still works as planned. Here, I think we're going to do something that is sort of the beginning of React. And this is really exciting. So if you've been zoning out for a few moments, I want you to pay back attention because this is about to start to look like, if you're a React developer, exactly what you've been doing all along with React. And this is going to be a key moment of connecting things. So right now, what you're looking at is functions. And that looks a lot like pure JavaScript. But things are going to start to look like React because really, we have this div container with children. And there's actually a little bit of a syntactically clearer way of writing this, which is, it's going to go like this. I'm going to put these on their own line. You can kind of see all the properties that are being passed. And again, this doesn't change what the code is doing. It just changes how we read the code. And I'm actually going to recast and put this up here so it's out of the way. You can sort of see, and I'm going to do some indentation here just to make it a little nicer for ourselves. You can sort of see something kind of interesting happening, which is we've got this div container, and we need to specify a little bit about its props, right? But then we just spend the rest of the time, featuring its children. And you can imagine that I could, create more children. Oops, let me call this second label 2, second label 3, and start to add these in a bit to kind of add in as many children as I want. And if I save that and refresh, you can see something brilliant, which is I'm just tacking on more and more HTML children to the section. And this is something actually profound that's happening, which is that when we started out this talk, right, we had a goal, which was that we wanted to create HTML. And that HTML looked a certain way, right? What it looked like was basically, you could see this clear indentation nested structure. There was an outside wrapping component, and inside of it, it had children that were sort of lined up, and maybe those children had children, et cetera, et cetera. And we switched to React, we switched to React and switched to pure JavaScript. And for the first time, our JavaScript is actually starting to look kind of like HTML. Yes, don't get me wrong, it's JavaScript, but look, you can basically see this is kind of like a wrapper div, right? It's kind of like this wrapper div. It's got this top section and this closing tag, just like this function, has this opening parentheses and this closing parentheses. And yeah, we have to specify props in the first. And if we ignore that, it's then got children that are all indented, right? One after the other, and they get rendered directly to the same structure in HTML. So you're sitting alone coding in 2010, and you're starting to freak out because you're like, wait a minute, have I basically invented the bridge that will port forever the beautiful structure of HTML we all know and love into JavaScript in a way that is more flexible, is more reusable, is declarative, is dynamic, can be scaled. And you're like, this is amazing. And so the first thing you do is you go and you call your friend. You're like, yo, April, like, this is crazy. Like, I need to show you this code. It's amazing. I've created this React library that can basically be wrapped into reusable functions that can then be used over and over again. And basically, I've created JavaScript that's like HTML that renders things to the DOM. And by the time you've finished your long-winded explanation, April just sort of looks at you. And she's like, wow, David, like, I'm so excited that you're excited. You're basically always excited. And I'm so excited that you're proud of yourself. You're really proud of yourself. But honestly, like, I love writing HTML because it's so explicit, it's so clear, and everyone can read it. And I like writing JavaScript because it's dynamic. But you've kind of introduced this weird thing, like, this doesn't really look like HTML to me. Like, yes, in your mind, you're making the connection, like, you're such a vision, but honestly, I'm not going to switch over to what you've done. And you sort of had this huge crest fall because you thought you were onto something. You thought you were going to revolutionize things. You created these reusable functions that automatically, created HTML elements that could then be rendered to the DOM. And you realized that you built a tool to create user interfaces, but your tool failed because your user interface for the developer sucks. And what I mean by that is HTML is a great user interface for developers in a lot of ways, right? I can see exactly what I'm writing. When I need to write something new, I can just go ahead and write it out, type it up. It's there, it's clear, it's declarative, I'm familiar with it. It's a great UI. So you're discouraged, but you're not to be stopped. You think there's something here in React. Maybe everyone would use React someday. And so you have a concept, which is what if I gave it a better user interface? And so you say, okay, April, I get it. Like you'll think of that special, right? Whatever, like just because you like do cool stuff and work at cool companies and you like have a great attitude about learning and like great at explaining things, like so what? Like I'm gonna like create a great UI that you'll be just like dying to use. And you go home and you think about, well, what did April say that she hated? And you think about it. Basically what you said is, I like HTML and I want to keep writing it, and nothing you can do is going to stop that. And if you want me to write JavaScript that's weird and it's trying to look at HTML, I'm not going to do it. And so you have this idea. You said, hey, well, what would April want to see? Well, what April would want to see is pretty stupid because she didn't like my thing. But what she wants to see is basically this. She wants to go ahead and copy, let's see, she wanted basically for me to copy this element and see in my JavaScript basically a whole bunch of HTML. Actually, I'm gonna go ahead and just do this, pull them up here. She basically want me to go ahead and take this HTML and somehow magically, in whatever silly way she would dream up, she'd want me to basically throw this in and say, okay, so you're gonna pass in props, and then for children, you can just literally say, boom, like, I want you to render this. And so basically, things would start to look much more beautiful and much better. So she'd be kind of like, well, instead of having to do this annoying React create element stuff, I just want to write some pure HTML. So what she would say is like, she'd be like, okay, well, forget this React create element with the span, the props, and children. That's stupid. I want you just to render this span. Like, just let me write in my JavaScript the actual thing that I want to see. Same goes for here. Like, you know, this is super annoying. Just kind of put this there. And for like this, you know, or I guess I'm mixing things up. But basically, you kind of get the sense. She just wants to basically see HTML in her JavaScript. And you're like, okay, well, this is kind of discouraging and frustrating because you set out with this whole project to be like, this is just JavaScript, like not HTML. You know, you don't need some fancy compiler, you don't need anything. But you do realize if the user interface sucks, nobody's going to use your code. And so you take a deep breath and you think, okay, I'm going to honor April's wish. I'm going to actually build a transpiler. And so what just transpiler is going to do is going to let you basically literally write out HTML in JavaScript. And then when you press save and when you run it, it's going to jump in right before it gets run into the DOM. It's going to say, oops, this is not valid. Let me go ahead and come in and replace this as all the information you need. I'm going to replace it with React.createElement div class children. Something that real JavaScript can be used. And the same thing goes here. I'm going to go ahead and replace the span HTML you wrote with the sort of JavaScript version to generate it. And so you go back to April and you're like, I've got this better user interface. You can just literally write HTML in JavaScript. And she's skeptical, but she's intrigued. So she starts to jump in. And at this point, for those of you who do React, you know that something kind of monumental has happened, right? Which is that when you do write React, you actually do write HTML right in the JavaScript. We call it JSX. And it's sort of this magical thing that nobody knows how it works. But as we've gone on this exploration, we've sort of started to realize that we want to move our HTML into JavaScript. And we need some way just to kind of do that and have it converted back to React. And you've actually built a way to do that. It starts with this sort of JavaScript functions and gets switched back into, or sort of starts with JavaScript functions that then you can write as HTML and get switched back to JavaScript before it gets compiled. And so something crazy happens. You look at the code you've been working on all day long, and you look at the seconds and sort of refresh, and like, wow, it's cool, the seconds sort of refresh every time I refresh. Then you look up, look at this thing, it's called the year. It says 2020. And you're like, what? I thought it was 2010. This whole time it's been 2010. I've been trying to reinvent the web. I've been trying to do things great, and it's 2020? And you're like, wait a minute. And you look, and when you go to job postings online, you notice something interesting. React is, everyone sort of wants to be hiring React developers. You sort of see these crazy charts where React is sort of be taking off over any other framework. Everyone sort of loves this thing called React. They're using it like crazy. You can look at these bar charts. You can see React in blue. Really, really common. And you're like, what is this React? And why does it sound so much like my React? And you go ahead to the React page where this whole thing started, right? Where they started for us, but your 2010 self didn't start here. And you kind of scroll down it and you look and you're sort of blown away. And what happens is you go in and you see all the ideas you came up with being used like they're just commonplace. You can see, in this case, it's a class, but it's basically a function called hello message that returns some HTML, but it's in JavaScript. And that gets rendered to real HTML. And you see this React DOM.render, which is the same as your React DOM.render. And they've sort of this weird like HTML in this, and they were sort of appending it to, you know, a root node to render it. And you're like, wait a minute, what is going on? This kind of looks exactly what I built. And then you see a little clip here at the top of the button that says JSX question mark. So you check it. And then you see something absolutely wild, which is almost exactly what you built in your code is now being used in this code. And I'm gonna actually just switch to where I have this code cleanly so we can kind of compare side by side. You're sort of blown away, which is that if you take a quick look just into here what we did, you know, for example, here, we created this title function in React.render. You'll notice that your React.create element exists exactly right here. And the first element is the tag, the first property is the first parameter is the tag name right here. And you're like, wait a minute, it's exactly like what I've been coding. The next thing is null in this case, but it can be the properties passed in. And the last thing is the children that you want to be rendered inside of that thing. And you realize that you've accidentally created React. And in that moment, in that excitement, you're like, this is crazy. I want to go use React. And so you sort of jump out. I'm going to kind of, you sort of jump back and you say, this is amazing. And so the first thing you do is you just go in and you import the React package, which sounds a lot like React. You import React DOM, which sounds a lot like React DOM. And then finally, you import this thing called Babel, which transforms basically this JSX, this HTML looking stuff, into the JavaScript that's vanilla and it actually runs. And you jump down here and you now say, okay, I've got this React with JSX title. I can kind of write what looks like HTML. And when I run this, it'll actually start to render things just like I want it. So you jump in here, go ahead and just delete this for clarity's sake. Jump in here, you refresh your page, and amazingly, nothing happens, which is exactly what you hoped. And amazingly, let's see, so we're back in here at index.html, refresh the page. It's not giving us quite what we expect. Oh, I know why. Okay. We are going to go ahead and we need to import the libraries that actually are the real React DOM and the real Babel that transforms it. So I'm just going to throw that right here. And now I'm going to refresh the page. And boom, amazingly, we've invented this new way of doing React. Basically, we've kind of stumbled upon React. And we can take a look at it. Basically, you create a function which simply takes in some properties you want to be set, like the children inside the style. You return what looks like normal HTML. And then with React DOM, you can render that to the DOM. And as you're in this playground, you start to realize how easy things are to do. And so for example, if you remember back in the day, we kind of had this JavaScript first approach to doing everything, which was ridiculously long. Let's just kind of see how easy it is to literally create this entire component, this entire section, just in React. And as we do it, we're going to kind of talk through this new React format. So first thing I'm going to do is say, well, React, as we know, on principle, is all about having components that you reuse. It's all about being declarative, which it is. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at my page and be like, okay, which are components that I can reuse? Well, these two titles have different colors which I can set, but they're basically the same thing. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump in, and I'm going to create a title function that takes in some props, and it takes, yeah, I guess I'll just take in props and goes ahead and returns this new JSX-y kind of situation. So what do I want it to be? I want it to be, well, an H1. And so I write, just for myself, this kind of stuff that April really wanted, which is just I'm writing HTML, but in JavaScript. And I know secretly behind the scene that this is going to get replaced with this actual React.create element. But for now, I don't have to think about that. I can just say, okay, I want an H1. And inside the H1, I want it to say the year. So I'm going to save that. And then I'm going to go in here. I'm going to just go like this. And I'm going to actually do something that's JS specific, which is basically, well, let me do first the more standard. I'm going to say title is a function. I'm going to pass it in some props, which in this case is nothing. I'm going to refresh the page. And I've got this component here. And then what I'm going to do is now I can basically say, well, let's go in and sort of do some things. Let's just go ahead and say, well, I want to pass in a props.style on this element. So I'm going to say style equals props.style. And what I'm doing is I can now go ahead and in my properties pass in a style and say that style should be, I want the color to be red. Oops, like that. And I can go here and refresh the page. And you can see I've now made it red, which may not seem exciting, but then you realize something crazy, which is this. If you create HTML components like this, can you treat your functions as HTML themselves? And this is sort of where React explodes in terms of being kind of reusable building blocks. And you're like, this is crazy. What if I just did this? I said, let's imagine there's an HTML component called title. And that title, I can specify props like style equals, in my case, color red. And will this run and work? And what's crazy is that it does. And this is sort of the magic and beauty of JSX, is that now we write functions and we treat those functions as if they were HTML that we know and love. And so as you're sort of discovering React, you're realizing, oh my gosh, I've got to tell April about this. This is sort of exactly what April was looking for, right? She gets to write that HTML she loves, but I can do it in a way that's dynamic and functional in JavaScript. And so what this starts to allow me to do is to do really reusable stuff. So let's build out the rest of this and kind of get a taste for that. So I've got this title component. It's got a props, and in the props, we pass a style property that we want to do. We might also. What was that? Let's see here. So I know I've been talking for a long time. We're going to sort of build this thing and wrap up. But basically, I can go ahead and say, hey, this is actually a reusable piece of code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take advantage of one thing that React just does naturally, which is inside the props, just for free, it's actually passed us the children. So you can go props.children. You can remember this thing we passed in explicitly before in our previous functions, but React bundles into the props. So I'm going to say props.children, right? And this is exactly the same thing that we were doing before. If you remember, when we were creating elements, we were going ahead and passing in all the children here. In this case, children was just some text. And so what I'm able to do is just go in here and say, okay, I want the title to be the year, like so. I'm going to refresh this page. And it works. Let me change the color to orange, or let me just change this so you can count the years. And I refresh this. React has rendered this, and it looks just like an HTML component. It's basically got properties to set on it, and it's got some stuff I can set inside of it. And this really sets us off into motion, because now I can mix HTML and JavaScript. And so I'm like, okay, this is awesome. Let's kind of play around. Let's build this whole thing. So the first thing I want to do is, let's just say I want to create a div wrapper. I know this like so. I go like that. I go into here. I put my title component. I give it a color of red, but actually I think the original color that we wanted was floral. So let me go in here and give it this color. And now I can say, oh, well, there's another title component. So I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate that. And this time change that to, let's see, what is this? The second color. The second color is orchid. Go ahead and set the color to orchid.
You're just like me. You can't use simple colors.
I know, exactly. And then say seconds past the minute, like so. Oops. And then I'm going to refresh the page. And boom, I've quickly created these titles. Remember how long this took us in other places? It kind of feels just like writing HTML. I could just specify what I want. And then here, I say, okay, well, I don't really want to use I don't want to use sort of like a React component. I just want to use pure HTML. So I can say, okay, let's just do a span and put 2010. Refresh that, refresh the page, and you can see, boom, I've got it just like that. And then you realize something. Actually, it's not 2010, it's 2020. It's been staring at me all day long. What the heck am I doing? We've got React. React is built with functions. It's declarative. It's beautiful. Okay, well, what can I do that I can't do in HTML? What I can do is basically open 2 curly braces and then just write arbitrary JavaScript in here. So I could write console.log hi. And now when I refresh the page and run that, go to the console, it actually just ran that code as if it's JavaScript. And I'm like, well, what I really want is to go ahead and specify what I want printed here. So let me just go ahead and say, let me just write some JS and say, let's get a new date, put it in here, boom, and now I can, oh, never mind, I know why this is broken. I can do some, just for the sake of brevity, I'm gonna do some JavaScript magic here. We can get the date, the current time, and I'm going to convert it to a string, like so. I'm just putting basically parentheses around this so they can be executed and I can keep doing it in one line. And boom, I've got the year 2020, right? You can imagine I can go here and say get seconds, like that, and it refreshes with seconds. And so now what I'm able to do is sort of work really quickly as if I'm in HTML, but I'm in JavaScript. I'm like using tags. I can go in here and say, okay, boom, I know there's a wrapper div. Inside that, I want to span. I also want my text editor to be better at formatting stuff. I'm going to create a new date. I'm going to get, I'm going to get the seconds. I'm going to convert it to a string. Boom, this is exactly what I want. Now I'm going to basically go ahead and create a new span down here. I'm going to put inside of it seconds, and I'm just going to use this as it's a pure HTML element. And suddenly, I've gone from this world where my HTML was sort of segmented and static and on its own, and had to sort of reach in awkwardly with JavaScript and slice it to pieces in this way that was just plain ugly and not very fun to work with here. Like I'm reaching in, I'm selecting, I'm changing things, and I've got this weird separation between what I'm displaying and sort of the things I want to inject into it. And now we go back to our new world, this React world, and it's beautiful. I can create reusable functions like title. I can take span HTML tags that I know and love. I can put JavaScript inside them and report them out. And amazingly, it all just gets rendered exactly how I suspect. And so now, we've covered a lot in this very short time. So I want us to take a quick breath. I certainly need to. I've been speaking at light speed, hopefully intelligibly. And I want us to reflect that we've taken a really big journey here from an old world into a new world. And that new world is React. But this isn't magic. And for me, even when I was working professionally, starting out as a web developer, I would just see this and I thought this is magic. I don't really understand why this is there. And actually we do. And what we know is going on is that this is not actually what happens when the thing runs. This gets converted to React.createElement. This gets converted to JavaScript. This also gets converted to valid JavaScript and then rendered. And we can sort of imagine how we're mapping all of these properties like style back into real HTML elements. And even though React feels magical, we know how the magic works behind it. And so I wanted to close sort of with where to now. So you've sort of gone on this journey with me of kind of accidentally inventing React and realizing how great it is. And the question is, why did React catch on? You know, what to learn next? What do you do next? And I think there's a lot to learn and explore. But I think one of the biggest things I want to leave you with in terms of why React has changed web development, among other things, a lot, and why it's so powerful is that you're able to start to build much more complicated and powerful things. And just like in our code when we started out to build this website, it's very simple, but the JavaScript with it was very complicated. If you really want to go pro, right, to go out and get a job or just build your own side project and build really epic things, you're going to have a lot of code. And you're going to need some really clear way to declare it and to edit it and work with it. And React makes it a lot easier. But there's something else that React starts to make really, really easy, which is that it helps you break your code into tiny pieces. And I think that's one of the biggest things that React brings, is that it's composable. And so I can actually do something like I can say const app equals a function that returns sort of all of this. And so I've taken all this great stuff I've written, and I can kind of abstract it away. And so I can go ahead and just say, okay, well, I just want you to render. Oops, that didn't work. Render my app to the web page. And while this doesn't change the UI at all, it starts to change the developer experience and your user interface. And you can start to break things into smaller and smaller pieces. So I can go ahead and say, oh, well, let me just call this the seconds region. This is not a very great name, but bear with me. I can go ahead and create a function that sort of lets me group that, and I'll call it seconds region equals this sort of function that doesn't take any parameters because everything's hard-coded, and returns some JS text like this. So again, just really simple JavaScript functions we know and love, but really lets you break the app down. And again, the UI hasn't changed, but the user experience and the UI of the developer totally has. And so I think that React is magical in the sense that it brings HTML into JavaScript, but it's more magical in the sense that it makes your code able to scale, able to be reused. And so think about it like this. Imagine we were working on a team, or April was working on my team, and I made a pull request into GitHub, into some repository or branch, and I had all this. April would probably look at it, sigh, and just skim over it and move on. But now with React, April can be like, well, what did you create? Okay, you created an app. It's got a title in it. It's got another title. It's got a seconds region. I can break down and just look at this. And what it lets you do is sort of zero in and see individual pieces and kind of work with these building blocks that then can be shared. And so I hope, as for those of you who are already on your React journey, you continue to learn and you think about the way that JSX gets transpiled down into React, down to JavaScript, and also the ways that, kind of all this developed, but also for those of you who are sort of new to React, you think about React not just as this magical thing, but sort of this way to create reusable building blocks. And ultimately, it's by creating those building blocks that we can build with each other, and we can build things that we never could have imagined before. So this is the end of my talk. Thank you so much for coming on the journey with me. I'm excited to take questions, or if you just need to go, take a break, that's great too. And thank you, April, for sort of manning and standing on guard.
No worries, no worries.
That was good.
The one thought that I had was, I know you were talking about earlier before when you tried to add in that second element and you had to rename it.
Yeah.
So if you go ahead and put a seconds region below that,
yeah, let's do it.
Use that component, you can show that that would again allow you to now reuse that without having to rename.
Exactly, and that's a great point, April, because basically, whereas before I was sort of manually creating DOM nodes, which is really messy. In this case, even though I'm writing what looks kind of like an HTML element, right? This is actually React, and it's a function, right? You can see it. It's literally a function. It takes in nothing, and it returns this thing. And so when it gets run, it creates new elements. Exactly right. Yeah. What I'm curious, April, did you have more thoughts? I know you're on the line and you're sort of tracking. You're someone who's, I know, has been working with, I mean, we're all sort of new to React. At least I've been doing it for a few years. You've sort of been doing different projects. You know React. What sort of stood out to you, if anything?
I don't know that I necessarily made the direct connection to the create element, and I mean, I guess I understood what it was doing functionally, but
Sure.
not literally.
Got you.
So that was kind of cool to see it broken down like that.
Yeah, yeah. It's not really magical anymore. You're like, I could write React. Well, I mean, that sort of the magic in React that is complicated is the sort of the way they've optimized it to sort of re-render things and with really dynamic apps. But in terms of just like putting them on the page, you could create this in an afternoon.
But I think it also importantly, it illustrates the need to have a solid understanding in JavaScript before you dive into React.
Sure.
Because I think a lot of times people get caught into the, oh, well, React is so easy to write, so therefore I'm just going to start with React. But at the end of the day, if you don't know what JavaScript is doing, then you also don't know what React is doing.
Right.
And so you're putting things together in a way that when something breaks, it makes it a lot harder for you to go in and diagnose and fix it.
Yeah.
And that really illustrates the why of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Right. Yeah, I like that point. And I think I wanted to say, like, I am guilty of using React because it's easy, but not understanding it under the hood. And this is sort of one of the first times I've come to understand it. So if you're feeling like that, you're not alone. Yeah. Let's see. I guess the last note I kind of alluded to this. I don't want to overload you, but I do want to just point out one thing that's different from what I created in my React and React DOM versus actual React is that there's something that's really special about React that's kind of technical under the hood, which is that my React is great. It's functional. It's literally, I've got these nested functions, right? So like, here's a div that returns a create element. Inside of that, it has a child that's called seconds region. Inside second regions, it's got another div. So it's sort of these nested functions that are kind of literally building out the nested tree that I'm in. And it kind of returns that and renders it. React is doing something a little bit different. I just want you to flag this for you so you kind of have context. React is doing something really magical. It's basically saying, hey, you've got this DOM, right? It literally exists in the browser. We're sort of rendering to it. But we're going to create an intermediary, which is that we're going to take what you write in JavaScript, and we're going to convert it to a virtual DOM, or a DOM that we're basically just a giant JavaScript object. And we're going to say, hey, we're just going to kind of take the structure of the DOM and keep it for ourselves, because React is kind of like a control freak. And they're going to be like, when you make changes to your apps, when the time changes, when you add a new element, when some click happens, we're not going to redraw everything on the page. We're just going to take the old version, this old sort of private virtual copy of what the whole web page looks like, what the DOM looks like. We're going to compare it to the changes that you've made. I'm going to go ahead and react to those changes by just changing what you need to change. And that's what makes React, in some cases, really, really fast. And I didn't talk about that at all, right? In my sort of like React version, we didn't talk about creating this virtual DOM and comparing it. It's pretty technical, but it's kind of what makes React fast. And that's definitely something to explore.
For sure.
Yeah, so unless there's more questions, or April, anything else you want to say?
No, I don't really see any questions. Mostly people's feedback has been really great. It was really helpful and helped kind of break it down for them. So I'm going to work on figuring out how to get the recording up, so anybody who maybe wants to rewatch some of it and go back over can do so.
Yeah. Awesome. Wow.
And then I think that's it.
Great. Awesome. Well, this is a lot of fun. It's sort of a marathon with me. Thank you for sitting through it with me, and looking forward to feedback or to seeing what you guys build. If you build something cool with React, share it, and I'd love to see. Yeah,
the Slack group has a projects channel. Feel free to
awesome.
Throw your stuff up there, works in progress, whatever. Just toss it out there and share with everybody. It's fun.
Cool. Awesome.